Hi, my name is Dave Yonamine. I'm the CEO and founder of a mobile gaming company out of California called Mobilityware. And my presentation today is to help developers leverage their success to expand to the rest of the world. So it's pretty specific, and so I hope that you folks can benefit from that. Now, obviously the question is, why does it matter? And the obvious thing is that as important as India is in the economy of the world, it's still a relatively small percentage of the global market, okay? So if you want to expand outside of India to the rest of the world, what do you have to take into consideration? Well, the thing that came about last year is GDPR. And so I have a question for you. How many are you with developers that have done things outside of India and had to worry about GDPR already? Okay, so a few. All right, I won't bother to read all these. You folks can do that. But GDPR is kind of interesting. And it's the first of a whole series of efforts that governments are imposing on people in an effort to promote privacy. Okay. And with GDPR in particular, people have a right to know what information is being collected about them and to be forgotten if they so choose. That's a relatively daunting task in some instances. Now, in particular, it affects apps that are providing information to third parties for things like advertising. So, how many of you have apps that do advertising here? Okay. Now, for those apps, providing information to the ad networks is considered selling that information, okay? At least in the way that the EU defines the word selling for GDPR, that's selling information. So providing that information makes all those companies subject to GDPR regulations. So why should I care? Well, the obvious thing is they set up a system so that they could find companies that are not compliant with GDPR. And the fines can be pretty large. 20 million, is a max for a small company. But for larger companies, it's really a percentage of the total revenue of the company. Up to 4% of the total revenue of the company worldwide. So not just in the revenue of the country that is calling your app to be, non-compliant, but the total worldwide revenue of the company. And to date, Google has received the largest fine, $57 million from the French regulators. Okay, but we think that will clearly be supplanted by someone else, and hopefully it's not you. Okay, but the fines can be getting close to the GDP of a small country like Tuvalu or something like that. And it is something to worry about. So there are a whole series of numbers that are published by this organization called lapp.org. This was from earlier this year. And there are already a good number of complaints that individuals have filed about requesting information. So we're, like I said, not a small company. We're a company of about 225 people in California. So, and we do operations throughout the world. And the US is under 50% of our user base. So the EU is substantial. And in this situation, we have had over 4,000 requests from users for their information. The point is that we are a company that tries to be compliant on this, and we get, not quite 100 requests a week on average. Okay. So for the rest of you that have done this, any idea how many requests you get on a weekly basis or monthly basis? Any idea? No. Is that something you track? Okay. Well, hopefully it's not large, but I do recommend that you track that. Okay. Because first of all, if you aren't tracking it, it could be that your system isn't working and you could be in violation of GDPR in that situation. What has Mobilityware learned? Number one, consent is the name of the game. That's what GDPR is. It's all about consent. Consent is the foundation for GDPR, and consent has to be freely given in order for users to be able to use your application. And this is not really a straightforward thing. Depending upon how your game works and the game flow, it does take a good amount of work. And at Mobilityware, it involved a large number of people working on this to really figure it out. And I would not say get it right, because the other thing about GDPR is that the interpretation of the regulations are changing. So you would hope it is a static document. The document may be static, but the interpretations are not. Look at that carefully and see what it takes to be compliant. It takes a whole company to really do it. And I say it takes a village here, but really it took the game teams to be involved. It took our BI team, to be involved. We had to check the internal data systems and to how data is shared between the different systems. Ad tech is involved because we have our own ad server that we use to display ads. Marketing had to be involved because we use that information for user acquisition. Monetization is clearly involved because we pass that information to the ad network so they can provide more targeted and hence higher paying ads. And then customer service has to be involved because, we think we provide good customer service, we track the users, but if someone says, well, I want to be forgotten, then all the customer databases have to be purged of that information as well. And unfortunately, not doing it could get you into more trouble, more than a paper cut, so to speak. So you have to have the appropriate response time for GDPR requests. That is, you have to be able to respond within 30 days of that request. How you present the data to the user matters, because if they can't explain it, it's considered ambiguous, and you can get into trouble for that. And thirdly, you have to get addendums to all your agreements you have with third-party providers to make sure that they comply with user requests as well. I mean, you as a company can do your part, but then you have to ask the ad network to then forget the user as well. So check out all your vendors, make sure that they are willing to do that for you, and be careful if they are not. Okay. As onerous as GDPR has been, that unfortunately is not the worst of the situation. Coming in January of next year, California has regulation that's going into effect called Ccpa. And what's the problem with Ccpa is not that it's that much more work than GDPR to actually comply with it, And as you can guess, Ccpa stands for the California Consumer Privacy Act. And you can read the details as to whom it applies. But what really is the issue with Ccpa is that it really sets the standard for the entire United States. So when we looked at CCPA, we determined that we could not determine if someone, well, it applies here to California residents, is what it says. But if you read the regulations, someone that's a resident of California that is temporarily outside the state is still subject to CCPA. So how do you determine if that user in Missouri is a California resident or not? Okay. So what it ends up requiring, at least as far as we can tell, is we have to treat everyone in the US as a California resident. Okay. That means that potentially there is a revenue hit for all the people that you're using, that all your users that are in the United States. So my question is, for your companies, how many companies do not think the United States is an important market for you? Is there anyone who thinks that can just ignore it? Okay, so if you can't ignore it, then CCPA is something that I think you have to worry about. Okay. The other aspect of CCPA that makes it, I'll say, more intriguing, to use a nice word, is the penalty side of it. So unlike GDPR, there is no cap in the fines that the state of California can levy against your company. That's a scary thought. Okay? Now, if you read the regulations, it seems relatively innocuous. Oh, fines are only up to $7,500 if it's intentional, or $2,500 if it's unintentional. But if you look at it more carefully, that's per instance. And an instance is an individual. So if you have a data breach or something like that, everyone that's exposed is a separate incident. Worse than that, every piece of personal information is considered a separate incident. So what that means is, if you have only 10,000 users in California, and each of them has 10 pieces of PII that are exposed, and it's unintentional, that's still $250 million in fines that the Attorney General of the state of California can levy against you. Is that all? No, there's more. Brazil is set to introduce privacy regulations similar to GDPR in August of next year. And more countries are also looking at that. So really, there's no getting around the situation. If you have personal information that you're providing to a third party or any outside agency, you are potentially liable for this, and the fines could be daunting. Now, I'm not saying you're going to have to pay $250 million. Obviously it could be higher too, because that was only 10,000 users in California. Okay, so it is serious. I think if you do nothing, that's the worst thing, because that will probably require or probably get them to take the most action. If you've taken action and have demonstrated you're serious about it, I think they will be more lenient toward you. But that's me trying to be rational about it. That's not what the law says. What does that mean? Well, I put this picture up because I sort of think that's what's required for a company to really get their hands around this whole privacy issue. You have your patient, your game or app that's out there, and you need everyone in your company to look at it carefully and think about how is data about that person being used? Okay. So as I said, think about it, plan for it, whether it's GDPR, CCPA, Brazil, or any other legislation. I think India probably will have its own as well. Okay. I think you should have a framework for dealing with it. The nuances from country to country will differ, but the overall framework is is something that you should have in mind to deal with. And that is unfortunately the cost of doing business here. But I think the cost of not complying and basically, ignoring all the regulations is much more likely to get you into trouble than not. What should you do? Well, educate yourself about it, evaluate your games and what you can do about it, and then go and execute on that. If anyone, I guess, has a company here that's looked at GDPR or CCPA and has a different view on it and wants to discuss that with me, I'd be happy to do that. All right, that's sort of the end of my formal presentation, because I don't like to read slides, but if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Any questions? Thank you so much, Dave, for the insights and the future policies which we are going to face in the 2020. Thank you so much.
Good luck.